Through the Partisan Looking Glass, the Social Psychology of Political Polarization with Professor Pete Ditto of the University of California, Irvine. In just 1 minute, we'll get started with this talk. Okay, thank you all for joining us. Wherever you are in the world, here in Irvine, it's uncharacteristically rainy day with thunderstorms in the forecast. Should there be a technical glitch, we'll do our best to solve it, but internet connections are what they are in this era of Zoom. I'm Graham Boucher. I'm the director of the Jack W. Peltison Center for the Study of Democracy here at the University of California, Irvine. And today I'm just delighted to welcome Professor Peter Ditto, Professor of Psychological Science here at the University of California, Irvine, who'll be giving his talk Through the Partisan Looking Glass, the Social Psychology of Political Polarization. Professor Ditto is an experimental psychologist with expertise on human judgment and decision-making, and his research focuses on hot cognition, how motivation and emotion shape and often bias our social, political, moral, medical, and legal judgments. His current research, which culminated recently in a publication with several co-authors from political science, sociology, psychology, in the journal Science, explores the process of political polarization, civic politics, and the moral and psychological underpinnings of the culture war in contemporary American politics. His article in Science was very provocative, assigned to my graduate class in American politics recently, argues that America is facing a rising political sectarianism, a poisonous cocktail of othering, aversion, and moralization that poses a threat to democracy, one that moves past traditional political science research on polarization, which conceptualizes how Democrats and Republicans diverge on political ideals and policy goals, and instead integrates much more research on the emotional tribal process, where parties are increasingly focused on not only winning, but on dominating supporters of the opposition parties, much more even than advancing their own policy goals. This process has somewhat regrettably been found in much of the recent research on affective or emotional polarization in political science, where one of the starkest findings is that Democrats and Republicans often in public opinion polls show even starker hatred or animosity to the opposing party than they do affinity to members of their own party. So negative partisanship, antipathy towards the opposition is increasingly characterizing and dividing our political moment. I am extremely excited to learn from Professor Ditto today, as I did in reading the article in Science with his co-authors. So please join me with a Zoom welcome to Professor Ditto. And again, should you have any questions, please type them in the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom. Professor Ditto, please join us.
Thank you, Graham. And thanks everybody for coming. Let me see if I can get this started. Yes, I'm coming to you from my office in my home in San Clemente. I hope on this nice rainy day, I hope everyone is well. And again, thanks. Let me see. Okay, so I think I'm set up. Again, thank you, Graham, for inviting me. Thank you all for attending. And again, the Zoom format's interesting, so I will try my best to make my presentation as interesting, I guess. On January 6th of this year, thousands of American citizens stormed the US Capitol building because they believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump through massive election fraud. Startling event, but the first thing I always like to note about it is that if it were true, right, if the election actually had been stolen from the American people through massive fraud, their behavior makes perfect sense, right? In fact, if I thought the election had been stolen, an American election had been completely taken away and produced invalid results, I would almost feel morally obligated to attack the Capitol myself, right? And so that's the problem is it isn't, right? That isn't true. There's no evidence of massive fraud, but many people believe that it is, and that directed their actions. Of course, many other people believe that the election was free and fair and legitimate, and they're angry at people who believe that was a fraud, right? So we have this two sets of people with two fundamentally different factual beliefs about the nature of this election, whether it was fair or whether it was fraud, right? And that drives their behavior. So it's that belief that I want to focus on today, those differential beliefs that people have, right? And so let me just sort of walk through a few of these, right? And I presented these data in the simplest possible way, right? I did this on purpose. I split them into Democrats, Independents, Republicans, kind of, again, washes over some nuance, but let me just walk through the idea here that this notion that we have different factual beliefs is common. It isn't just the election. So here's the election data. The results of the 2020 election were free and fair. 80% of Democrats believe that's true. The majority of Republicans believe that that's not true, that the election was not fair. Independents end up in the middle, right? Different, again, this is a factual belief. This is an opinion. This is something that's either true or it's false. And that's crucial about all of these. These are things that have some descriptive validity to them. They can, at least theoretically, be discovered to be true or false, right? Another one, so is the weather more extreme in the past few years or about the same? Well, 91% of Democrats believe that the weather's more extreme in the past few years. The majority of Republicans believe that it's about the same. Independents end up right in the middle. Another question, police tougher on blacks or treat whites and blacks the same? 77% of Democrats believe that the police are tougher on blacks. Most Republicans, the overwhelming majority, think that they treat them the same. Independents end up about in the middle. Well, how about in the recent Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearings? Well, do you believe Christine Blasey Ford or Kavanaugh was telling the truth? Well, 73% of Democrats believe that Christine Blasey Ford was telling the truth. The majority of Republicans believe that Brett Kavanaugh was telling the truth, and independents end up right in the middle. And finally, just oldie but a goodie, did the Russian government interfere with the 2016 presidential election? Again, either they did or they didn't. 84% of Democrats believe that they did. Most Republicans, 85%, believe that they didn't. Independents are right in the middle. And that sort of characterizes the state of the union right now. What Kellyanne Conway so famously referred to as alternative facts. And I'm going to use this term a lot during the talk, alternative facts, but I don't mean, again, alternative factual realities. I mean alternative factual beliefs, different beliefs about what the nature of the world is. And this seems to be a dominant feature of American culture right now, that the left and the right, that red America and blue America, have different beliefs about the nature of the world, these alternative facts. And that what I'm interested in talking about is how they got these facts, how this happens, and how this plays out in this mess of a corrosive political environment that we're in right now, where we have two sides who spend most of their time trying their best to dominate and hurt the other. And so in my talk today, what I want to do is I want to talk about how it is that these differential factual beliefs, these alternative facts, occur, and how they play themselves out in this polarized political environment. In order to do that, what I want to talk about, three different processes. These are three completely natural normal human processes, group processes that occur and that together contribute to polarization. Well, I'm going to talk about moralization, factualization, and socialization. So moralization takes teams and turns them into these sort of pseudo-religious tribes. Factualization takes moral opinions and turns them into moral facts. And socialization takes individual beliefs and turns them into socially validated truths, right? And so all three of these processes sort of operate, and they set the stage for, I think, the difficult political situation that we're in right now. So first, let me talk about moralization. So moralization, again, is this process of infusing preferences with moral value, right? So taking something that you can treat many things. So a good example of this is cigarette smoking. So in the past, cigarette smoking was simply a preference. Now, over time, it's become moralized so that people who choose to smoke cigarettes by many people aren't seen as just making a choice. They're doing something bad, something immoral by doing that, right? And that's this process that happens. And when situations get moralized, it turns up the heat. It has a whole series of psychological effects. So let me talk just kind of in a really broad sense, talk about how to think about politics in this way. So we've got two different sets of sort of policy positions here. You know, I call them liberal econ 101 and conservative econ 101. So liberals believe raising, if you want to help the economy, raising taxes, investing in a safety net, raising the minimum wage. Conservatives believe cutting taxes, cutting safety net, cutting regulations, right? And there's two different ways of conceiving that difference of opinion. One is sort of this pragmatic view that we all have the same intention, right? The two sides, liberals, conservatives, really want to do the same thing. They want to improve the economy. They just have different ideas about how to do it, right? So again, Republicans want to cut taxes, liberals want to raise them. And when they look at, there's a way you can imagine politics in which this is simply a simple difference of opinion. Oh, my friend is mistaken, right? Though your policies aren't going to do what you aren't going to achieve the goal we want. And at best they're dumb and you're dumb for believing them, right? So, but it's an honest difference of opinion. We both have the same intention. We're just trying to get there. And boy, your way may be worse or better than mine, but not a problem. And compare that to the sort of moral view that's developed, right? Where it's not that the two sides have the same goal, but different ideas about how to get there, right? That they have a different intention, that, the other side is trying to destroy the economy. They're trying to take it over. They're trying to, reward the people they want and punish the people that they want. Right, so they're trying to do something different than we are, right? They're not dumb anymore. They're evil. They're bad. They're trying to do something wrong, right? And that's the way that politics can be conceived. It could be this sort of the way, this sort of idealized way we talk about it, where two people have different opinions, they work out nicely, or it can be two sides warring about one side good, my side good, the other side evil, right? And that seems to be what's developed, right? This sort of moralized view of politics. You see this in all kinds of ways. Here's a couple of quotes from the left and the right. So we got Steve Smith, again, who used to be a Republican, but on a fixture on MSNBC saying the Republican Party is corrupt, indecent, and immoral. They have disgraced the country, brought dishonor to the party of Lincoln. On the other side, Tucker Carlson's has an equally sort of evil view of the Democratic Party. Today's Democratic Party, they despise this country. They have said so. They continue to. That is shocking, but it's also disqualifying. We cannot let them run this nation because they hate it. Imagine what they do. So this seems to be what the state that we're in, where the two sides aren't right or wrong. They're right or wrong, right? They're morally good or evil. And that was this idea of how moralized politics have become, was really sort of the underlying force behind this paper in Science on political sectarianism. So we were sort of struggling for a way to describe this and capture this phenomenon. What we decided is, again, when politics gets moralized, it becomes something like religion, where, again, the people don't have just a different opinion from you. They have an evil opinion. They are heretics, as opposed to somebody simply with a different way of getting there. So the two sides, liberals and conservatives in this party, have become almost more like political sects, fighting over the, who should, who has the true vision of America's civil religion, right? Is it the conservative story or the liberal story? And your version of that is something that I find morally reprehensible, right? So this idea that they're more like sects. And again, the data here that Graham referred to as well, is just kind of, you can see the tracking of this kind of phenomenon where, again, and this is over time from 1980 to 2020, these are thermometer ratings of how much you like your own party versus the other party. And you see that the positivity of your own party stays relatively stable over those 40 years. But what's going down is people are developing a more and more negative view of the out party, right? This idea of affective polarization, that the actual policy positions are pulling apart as much as that what's pulling apart is our affection for one another. And this idea of negative partisanship, that a lot of this is a negative view of the other side, which is partly what moralization produces, right? Moralization produces sort of this, if you differ from me, you must be bad. And you can see that again, if you this is just subtracting the two from an in-party love and subtracting out-party hate, and you see that, it's only been since 2012 that there's been more hate than love, right? So this is characterizing the two sides as in this kind of moral battle that's different. Just one last kind of really good indicator of this, I think is always the best way to think about it, right? Is, would you be unhappy if your child married somebody of the other party, right? And that concept, that feeling, right, has become that's sort of the tribal feeling. If somebody marries outside of your religion or outside of your tribe or ethnicity, right? That's historically been this problem, right? And you see that these are just the data on whether people are unhappy about it if their spouse married. So Republicans are still most upset if their spouse, if their child marries somebody who's transgendered or somebody of the same gender, right? But next up is somebody from the Democratic Party. So they'd rather their child marry somebody from a different religion or a different ethnicity than from the Democratic Party. For Democrats, it's right up top, right? The worst thing, you can marry a transgender person, same sex, etc., but just don't bring home a Republican, right? Just don't. That's a real mixed marriage, right? So increasingly, and people have made this point. Chantal Yangar at Stanford has summarized a lot of this data in this, and the way I characterize it is red and blue are the new white and black, right? So he says that in many ways, this prejudice against the out party is more intense very often than racial prejudice that people will show, or it seems to resemble that more and more. Again, that's that feeling of that moralization, the good and evil casting. Now, how does that happen? Well, the first thing to note, I mean, there are lots of political scientists here that could probably tell a better story about the historical development of a lot of these things. Let me tell a little bit of the psychological story. Again, part of it begins with the fact that the two sides have different moral views. They have different moral sensitivities, right? So those are genuine differences in morality that have become, again, more intense, I think, because as the parties have purified, right? As the parties have become more, where the Democrats have become more the pure liberal party, Republicans more the pure conservative party, right? So you have a clash of people who have these two different foundations or these two different moralities. Now, I've done a certain amount of research on this. This is the work that I did with Jonathan Haidt and a variety of our graduate students on the development of moral foundations theory, which is an attempt to sort of describe the different moral sensitivities of the two sides. Again, it begins with this idea that morality is an intuitive affair, that it's something we feel, that we have these sort of evolved intuitions, and that's where we respond sort of gut level to certain things. That's what morality is all about. And it's built on these 5 different foundations, 5 different intuitions about morality that you could think of as like moral taste buds. They're emotional triggers that make us feel that certain acts are right or wrong. And groups differ. Everybody sort of is sensitive to all 5. And John has talked about 6 of these different foundations. It doesn't matter too much, right? So that the idea that there's these multiple foundations and groups differ, they all are sensitive to them, but they may differ. Certain cultural factors may dial them up and down. Sensitivity. And this led us to think about, well, what are the moral differences between liberals and conservatives? We collect a whole bunch of data off this website that we developed together. This is my little pitch for it, yourmorals.org. It's kind of in the process of a complete reimagining and restructuring. But we've had this since 2008, collect data, people come in, they get feedback back on their, when they fill out questionnaires. There's been like 800,000 people who have come through this, right? And many of them took this moral foundation questionnaire, which measures how much people are sensitive to these different moral intuitions that I talk about. And here's just a basic pattern really quickly that we find again and again and again. So that there's these 5 different primary sort of moral intuitions, that things are morally wrong if they harm people, particularly vulnerable people. It's good to be fair. You need to treat people justly and fairly and with equity. In-group loyalty. So we have a sensitivity to, we should be loyal to our groups, and betraying groups is particularly bad. Authority and tradition, this sort of valuing of authority and tradition, and this idea about purity and sanctity, that there's a non-contaminated state of sort of essence that's close to God or close to purity here. Right, and so these are these different foundations. This is how people rate them as being relevant to their moral views across the political spectrum, from just a 7-point scale, from very liberal to very conservative. And this pattern just turns up again and again and again. And the essence of it is that, again, liberals seem to have a 2-factor morality. They care mostly, and this is liberal sort of first of all, in the broadest sense. This is what liberal education sort of does. It tells you things are only wrong if they hurt somebody vulnerable or if you're unfair to people. Right, these other things like in-group loyalty and authority to tradition and purity, those are fine, but they're sort of conventional things that I don't worry too much about. And so liberals clearly show that they value harm and fairness much less than these other 3. Conservatives, on the other hand, seem to have this more traditional 5-factor morality, where they care about harm and fairness. Again, that doesn't vary much across the political spectrum, but what does is how much you value in-group authority and purity, so that all 5 of those are seen as very valuable moral values to be honored, right? So we get this, that when we're viewing these day-to-day political events, we view them through the lens of these different moral sensitivities, and it can help to explain how we have these sorts of different reactions. So this is just a simple example. The 2 sides obviously have different feelings about same-sex marriage, and that makes sense if you look at this through the moral foundations theory lens. So for liberals, they care about harm and fairness. So what they care about is that again, that gay marriage doesn't harm anybody, and in fact it harms people to deny them the ability to be married. And it's fair. It's only the idea of marriage equality, right? It's only fair to let gay people marry who they want, et cetera. Generally let people marry who they want. So through the lens of a liberal, gay marriage is unmitigated good, right? It's just, there's only good things about it, right? Support it. Through the conservative lens, it's a little more complicated. They may feel some of those same things about harm and fairness, but they at best could be ambivalent because these other moral reactions seem to be driving it. Well, gee, I wish they'd just be, can't gay people be better group members? They don't seem like they don't dress like other people, and they act out, and gee, I don't like that. And it's not really traditional, of course, male, the idea of traditional marriage between one man and one woman, this violates that, and I'm attached to that. And it seems kind of, I don't, to use a technical term, icky, right? There's something about it that makes me feel when I see something like that. And all those reactions that conservatives are having, right, are mixed in with the others, and so they have a less positive view of it, right? So we have these different moral, and people don't support policies that they only feel ambivalently about, and so you can see where the enthusiasm for liberals for supporting same-sex marriage is very different for conservatives. And so through this lens of these different moral foundations, right, we can think about that people just have these different moral reactions, and as the parties are going to become purer, more liberal, more purely conservative, right? that it's possible that just have nice, the whole idea of moral foundations theory, for example, was to try to promote a more civil sort of discourse, to realize, oh, other people have different opinions about things because they have a different set of moral values, right? Can't we just accept that and talk about it? And that would be wonderful, but that's not the way morality generally works, right? When two groups have different morals and they're interacting with one another, right? It creates friction right away, because when somebody does something that violates your morality, you feel angry about that, right? So just the fact that groups with different morality are interacting, there's going to be tension, right? And particularly what I think is, what I've been really interested in is a particular kind of tension that builds up in these situations that I call grievance. And so lots of people have talked about grievance, and I just want to talk about this as kind of a moralization process, that as the two sides feel like the other side treats them unfairly, that just raises the temperature even more, right? The way I talk about this is that the archetype, I think, of human conflict is two kids in the back seat of a station wagon, right? So there's two kids back there, they got to share the same space, they're connected, right? And they start fighting, right? And they're beating each other up back there. And if you say, hey, what's going on back there? And the first one says, well, he hit me harder, or he hit me first. While the second one says, but he hit me harder, right? So everybody's aggrieved. One says, oh, I got hit first, I got hit harder. I'm owed, my anger is justified. My feelings of I've been treated unjustly, just like the Republican Trump supporters felt like they were treated unjustly if their election is taken away, just like many Black Lives Matter advocates feel like the Black and people of color in this country have been treated unfairly, right? And so we need that needs to be righted. And that sense of grievance that I've been wronged, right, is it moralizes even further. It raises the temperature. Now I feel it. People try to emphasize grievance because it mobilizes action, right? It makes you want to do something. It makes you angry, right? And it tends to escalate conflict. People who are aggrieved have lower moral standards. So something that they would have thought was wrong before, like invading the Capitol, becomes morally acceptable because of the grievance. I wouldn't do that, but they took over our country. They defrauded an election, right? So it lowers standards, and in that way, it also it escalates conflict because everybody does. They're more likely to do immoral things, and to find those morally acceptable. And every time, if I take one Supreme Court justice away from you, well, you got to take two away from me. It tends to escalate in that way, and it spurs all this kind of animosity and a lot of bias and perception. I'm really interested in this phenomenon of grievance that I think is happening, out in contemporary politics, clearly these days. So here's where we're at, right? So we have this moralized political culture where the two sides don't see each other as just having different opinions, but one side is good, the other side is evil, fueled by genuine moral differences, by grievances, right? And what at that point it gets more intense because it starts to change the way you process information. It contributes to this biasing of information, political information as it's received. And that brings us to the second process that I call factualization, or which is I would define as the recruitment of descriptive beliefs to support prescriptive intuitions. So again, it's this idea that you have this moral fervor, information comes in, and that you want to believe that your moral beliefs have some standing in some way to argue that these are real, these are powerful, right? And so one way to do that is to reinforce your moral beliefs with factual information, factual beliefs. So let me kind of go back to this sort of idea before that I presented before. So here again, you got liberals on the left and conservatives on the right, and their economic policies. And again, those economic policies you can see sort of reflect their own moral views. So on the left, the right thing to do, their moral intuition is that you need to take care of people in need. And that's, there's this need to take care of people who are poor. It's not their fault. The conservatives are more likely to sort of have this, again, caricaturing this, that the right thing to do is really, what my moral intuition is, we've got to teach people responsibility. You got to teach them how to take care of themselves, right? Give them boundaries and things like that. And that's really the moral way to approach this situation. And those moral views are perfectly legitimate. Right? People can have those different moral intuitions. Now, the problem is that those moral intuitions shape the factual beliefs that people are receptive to, right? So one way to kind of, how do you solve this argument? I think the right thing to do is help people. I think the right thing to do is teach people responsibility. Well, one thing to do is, I've got data that shows that if you help people, it makes the economy better, right? Well, then all of a sudden, it's not just you arguing that it's best thing to take care of people, but taking care of people is also the best economic policy, right? So those ideas is that these moral views recruit factual information. If you can recruit factual information, if you can factualize your moral intuitions, right, it gives you this foundation to work with, right? It holds them up. So it's one thing to say, yeah, we want to help people, and if we help people, the nation will be better off, right? We want to teach people responsibility on the right, and if we teach people responsibility, we'll be better off. So everybody's looking to sort of provide factual support for their moral positions, and this biases the way they process information. So they build up and reinforce these moral views by processing facts differently and coming to different factual views, right? So just to give you an example, that this is the kind of thing that happens. So the one thing to note again about this is that the moral view and the factual view don't have to have anything to do with one another. It can be true that the moral thing to do is to help people, right? But that might not help the economy. There's no logic that says that, in fact, moral intuitions are about things that aren't very practical, right? Or that moral judgments are independent of practicality. So something could be the right thing to do, even though it hurts people, right? We'd be better off taking one person, harvesting all their organs. We could save 10 other people. So it would be more effective to do that, but it would be wrong to do that, right? So those two aren't separate, but people in their minds bring those together, and they recruit factual information to support their moral beliefs. These are data, 1,500 or so people from Your Morals. We had them fill out a whole bunch of judgments about 4 different kind of classic moral dilemmas in politics: the death penalty, enhanced interrogation, embryonic stem cell research, and teen condom education, whether you should give teens condoms. We actually have exactly the same data on maybe 10 other issues. So it all kind of shows the same pattern. But every time what you get is this pattern where when we have them rate how immoral it is, right? The more immoral they think it is, the fewer benefits they think it has, and the more cost they think it has. Now, I say inherent morality here just because when we ask them these questions, we ask them, for example, is capital punishment immoral even if it was effective, right? So even if it did good things, it's immoral. So it's this sort of sense of the act itself is immoral. And the more people think that, again, the death penalty is immoral, right? The more, the less effective they believe it is in determining or deterring crime, and the more they think it has all kinds of costs. In fact, the more they estimate, they give higher estimates of its rate of wrongful executions, right? And that makes sense that if it's morally bad, it must not be very effective. It doesn't have many benefits, and it has many costs, right? And so that you find this pattern again, that what we perceive as moral, we also perceive as effective, as producing the best outcomes in the world. Now, of course, this pattern is just correlational. It could be that, yeah, when people think something doesn't have any benefits and has a lot of costs, it's wrong to do it, right? So the direction could flow this way, and it certainly does in some cases, kind of a utilitarian moral view. Well, we have good evidence that if you manipulate morality, it changes the costs and benefits. So if I change how moral you think the death penalty is, if I convince you the death penalty is more immoral, you're going to give lower, we find that you give lower estimates of its deterrent efficacy, higher estimates of its rates of wrongful execution. So people, it's the moral intuition that drives them to recruit the facts that support that position. right? So that's the pattern you get, that people, and how does this happen? How do we find these facts to support our moral beliefs? Well, the problem is that we're too easy on information, right? Is that what we want to believe, we tend to take in; what we don't want to believe, we tend to reject. These are just some really simple studies that were run by a graduate student of mine over the last few years, Jacob Rode, and many others. And I just want to kind of show these really quickly because they're kind of fun. So he took PolitiFact statements from the fact-checking website PolitiFact. And again, he took ones that were from each of their categories. So these are actual facts in the world, or some are fake facts, but their categories: true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, pants on fire. Some of them were kind of conservative friendly. They were things that conservatives would want to believe. Some were things that were liberal friendly, things that liberals would want to believe. And we just presented them to people and asked them if they were true or not, right? And this is how the percent that said these things were true. And what you see, again, is you get this, kind of consistent pattern where when you give people conservative friendly beliefs, conservatives are more likely to believe them to be true than liberals. But if you give them liberal friendly beliefs, liberals are more likely to believe those than conservatives are. So they simply believe the facts that they're more supportive of their opinion. Again, that's a significant effect. But I mean, the thing to note too here is that I always like about these graphs is that there's a real sense in which people are tracking reality as well. They're basically tracking whether things are true or false, and they have this gap where people are simply more likely to believe the things that support their politics rather than undermine them. And here's just another study. We've just done this with many different kinds of facts. This is a different study with different facts, same pattern. Different study, same facts, different pattern, or same pattern. It's interesting. In this study, we were able to we separate out pro-Trump and anti-Trump conservatives, and you see that again. What you get is this interesting effect, so that the anti-Trump conservatives could become much more similar to liberals, or in this, right? And what you get is this separate out where the Trump in orange, of course. The Trump line is, they're more likely to believe conservative friendly facts, less likely to believe liberal friendly facts compared to other conservatives. Right. And this is a point I want to kind of tip, this idea of extremity, that there's a group of extreme conservatives that are sort of deviating from everybody else, is a theme I want to kind of point out and seems to pop up frequently in my work. So why do people believe these facts, right? Well, what I've been spent a lot of time studying, my kind of primary interest has been in how people process information that they want to believe versus that they don't want to believe. So getting at the more at a process level, right, what's happening is that there's this phenomenon that I call motivated skepticism, that people are simply less skeptical consumers of information they want to believe than information that they don't want to believe, right? And there's been dozens of studies that basically show this kind of effect, right? We present people with a scientific study, and this is the kind of classic old study from Lord, Ross, and Lepper in 1979. You present people with a scientific study about the deterrent efficacy of the death penalty in this case, right? And everybody reads that, and they simply take that method and they read details about the methodology of the study. The methodology is always the same, and they simply change the results to say, oh yeah, the evidence seems to suggest that the death penalty does deter crime, or the death penalty doesn't deter crime. Again, same methods, right? And then they bring in people who have established beliefs of either being opponents of capital punishment or proponents of capital punishment. And then the key dependent measure, in a sense, is how they rate the validity of the science. And what you get is this nice pattern that shows up again and again. So opponents of capital punishment, they think the study's a terrific, well-conducted study if it is anti-deterrence. Conservatives don't think it's such a good study when it's anti-deterrence. But if you come over and look over here, again, proponents think this is a good study if the results are pro-deterrence, and liberals think it's not so good. And again, the important point to recognize is it's the same study. It's exactly the same methodology with all the counterbalancing that goes on. So people are rating exactly the same study as a good study if it supports their beliefs, and a bad study if it doesn't support their belief. So information that's essentially the same, if it comes in, we accept it if it supports what we want to believe, our team, our views. We reject it if it's not. And that process goes on again and again and again. It's not just about science, right? It's not just about evaluation science. It's the same process that happens, for example, on Facebook. When you get a Facebook post that says some terrible thing that Trump does, you go, oh, great, and forward it, right? Without fact checking it. If it comes in and says some terrible, some positive thing about Trump or something else, oh, we immediately go down, we fact check, right? We look, we check it out before we share it, right? So how many people have shared something and then have somebody come back and say, that's not true, right? That's almost always, again, something we want to believe. And this general process of people simply looking at the same piece of information and seeing something different is really, really common, right? This is the nature of the bias that most bothers people, right? Is that people seem to take the same thing. It's this idea of the whataboutism, right? That people call it on, but you see it. So if my guy golfs, that's okay. Your guy golfs, he's lazy. Same thing with, the same behaviors, vacationing, executive orders, and all these kind of presidential behaviors. Same thing with the filibuster. It's kind of good when it helps us. It's bad when we want it. Supreme Court, late term Supreme Court appointments, well, they're fine. If it's our guy, they're wrong if it's your guy, right? So that idea that the same thing is only different really captures the nature of this bias, right? That we take in information. We're much easier on information that supports our side, right? And that, again, the idea that this is a ubiquitous bias was, there's lots and lots of evidence. What I tried to do I just ran in my lab a few years ago, a meta-analysis where we tried to combine all the studies we could find that were just like this. So the essential idea, right, is to take studies where you've got liberals or conservative positions, you present them with liberal or conservative friendly information. And then what you can do is you can gauge how biased people are by how differently they evaluate the same piece of information if it supports their beliefs versus doesn't support their beliefs. So that difference, it's the same methodology that's perceived differently depending on its results. You can take that as a gauge of how biased liberals are. Here, you can take this difference as a gauge of how biased conservatives are, and then you can compile all those and see, well, who's more biased? Are people biased? And is the level of bias the same on the liberal and conservative side? So we did that. There were 51 different studies, over 18,000 people. These are all these really careful experimental studies that use these matched information designs, right? So they're studies where they present people with as close as you can possibly get to exactly the same information and just manipulate whether it's liberal or conservative friendly. When you look at those data combined, right, on this graph. So this is when people are more moving in this direction, you're more accepting of liberal and conservative information. Again, exactly the same information. This way, you're more accepting of conservative and liberal information. And what we found was that both sides were biased, right? So this is a fair, not a huge effect size, but it was very robust across different methodologies. So conservatives are more likely to believe exactly the same information if it supports conservative views than if it supports liberal views. Liberals are more likely to support information if it supports liberal views than if it supports conservative views. And the two sides do that to virtually the identical degree, right? So both sides do it. Now, I want to just note really quickly what I think these data suggest. These data aren't there to suggest that in the real world, bias is equally distributed across all these different people, right? It's these are data that are about these really careful experimental studies and really talked about the sort of susceptibility or vulnerability to bias that both sides, I think, are capable of bias. It's a really fundamental idea that the groups we're attached to, we like and we are easy on. Groups that we aren't attached to, we're tougher on, right? So that everybody's got that potential, right? And it can play out. There's a lot of other societal factors, that can play into that we can talk about, including the behavior of political actors. So these are all experimental studies. Let me just really quickly give you two examples of things that go on outside. So this is, again, those are all these experimental studies, but you can find this kind of bias out in the real world. This is one of my favorite studies by Lee Epstein, where she looked at Supreme Court justices, again, supposedly the smartest, most fair people, that we elect them, we choose them for that reason, right? And these are where they look at cases that have implications for free speech. And of course, some of those cases are kind of conservative free speech cases, things like religious liberty. Other ones are more liberal free speech cases, things like whistleblowers. And what you find is that the two sides even have a different way of approaching those. So if you look at the conservative justices, she found that they were much more likely to value free speech as, make that argument if it was conservative free speech and if it was liberal free speech, right? The liberal justices were more likely, again, in this case, slightly less, but again, more likely to sort of support free speech if it's liberal than if it's conservative. Again, free speech is a different thing depending on whether it's liberal friendly or conservative friendly, even in the Supreme Court. One other really quick thing is another student of mine, Dan Relihan, who did this wonderful study with Allison Holman and Dana Garfin and Roxy Silver, but they have these wonderful data that I think showed, again, it's kind of bias in the real world. So the response to the COVID-19 pandemic is one of those politicized things where clearly conservatives didn't, worrying about it and believing it's serious was not in their best interest, right? It hurt their President Trump. Liberals felt more, and we all see this sort of lots of great data for the politicization of this. This is just taking this and comparing it to something that was in many ways was very similar, just like we do in the experiment. So Roxanne Silver happened to have data on how people responded to Ebola crisis. These are both nationally representative data, and you see the same kind of pattern. Two different pandemics. With COVID, as the more conservative you got, the less worried you were. But so you might imagine the same thing happened with Ebola, but with Ebola, when the political pressures were very different, right? The more conservative you get, the more you're worried about Ebola. So again, that sort of the evaluations of this pandemic follow the political winds, and health behaviors do the same thing, right? So again, this is one where real world data, real super significant social problem. How do we deal with this pandemic? And you see that even those you see the evidence of politicized. If it supports my views, I accept it more. Let me scoot through the last of this part, right? So again, what you've got is these moral views that drive people to take in information, factualize those views, and generate these different facts, right? Then what happens is these facts get stamped in by social processes, right? And that's where this last part about socialization. So many of you know about Wikipedia, I assume, right? You know that Wikipedia is a place you can go look up stuff online. Did you know that there's a Conservapedia, that there's a version of Wikipedia that has conservative facts, right? Where you could go and you want to look something up, you can look them up on Conservapedia. And that's it's sort of the encapsulation of the problem. We've got information that's liberal, we have information that's conservative, and people live in these different worlds, and they're socialized into these worlds. And again, I use socialization exactly the same way that a sociologist would, right? It's learning the norms and values and beliefs of a culture, right? And what we've got is then once you get these different beliefs, you go into your different informational environments and you learn more and more about those, and those become reinforced in you. So again, as we know, as I always say, I grew up in a 3-channel world. You had ABC, NBC, CBS. If you wanted to believe some weird thing during the day, you could, and then you turned on the news at night and Walter Cronkite told you what the real truth is, right? That's not the information environment that we are in anymore. Hundreds of different places you can find sources that you can rank. People know where, what's conservative, what's liberal. And so people drive into these different informational environments, and they're differentially socialized to believe these different facts, right? So there's really these two effects that happen, that people selectively, good evidence that people selectively expose themselves to information that supports their views. Liberals watch MSNBC, New York Times, conservatives watch Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, as the cliche goes. Really good evidence that, again, people tend to tune to information that seems to support their views, and that once they do that, that similar minds, when people get together, it tends to reinforce and polarize their view. There's just nothing more powerful in making somebody believe something is having somebody else believe it too, right? When you see newscasters telling you that these things that you kind of wish were true are true, it's very powerful, right? And again, we live in these informational worlds where we get socialized, where these sort of ideas that we have get driven in. These are some data from another student of mine, Christian Rodriguez, and these are I think these are national election study data from 2000 to media data from 2000 to 2012. They looked at, this is a measure that he developed of selective exposure, again, how much you're paying attention to your own media. And what you see is over here, when you first of all, it's increasing. So people are increasingly ensconcing themselves in these media environments. In this case, it looks like Republicans, and he found that Republicans did this a little bit more than Democrats do. Interestingly, when you then break out them by the extremity of their political views, what you get is the outlier really being, interestingly, the extreme conservative view. So the extreme conservatives are really, again, more and more selectively exposing themselves to their kind of information. And actually the lowest, the people with the most balanced diet are moderate conservatives down here. So kind of, again, it's another sense that there's something about this extreme group that's breaking off. Same thing happens on the internet, right? These are just data from, tweeting and retweeting. We live in different internet worlds where we interact with the people in our group and very seldom ever cross that chasm. Increasingly, we live together, we live with groups, so there's this residential sorting phenomenon that's going on that increasingly liberals live near liberals, conservatives live near conservatives. This is a wonderful book, The Big Sort by Bill Bishop, started this, and lots of other data support it. That, again, that's where we're getting more and more of these landslide elections, because people tend to be near each other. So they're watching people just like them, they're hanging out with people just like them, and so they only hear their side of the story. And to the extent that you do that, again, it kind of socializes these views into you. Another effect that it has is this kind of fact inoculation effect, right? So it's not just that you're getting this information and you're hearing other people say it, but they're telling you we're the right news and they're the bad news, right? So our media, but when you say your media is fair and balanced, you're implying that the other media isn't fair and balanced, that we have the right facts and they don't. Our media is accurate. Theirs isn't. Therefore, it gives you, if you hear something in the New York Times, you can just say, it's the New York Times. I don't believe that, right? Oh, yeah, I was in the Wall Street Journal. Pff, I don't believe that, right? So you get this ability, what it provides, this ability to inoculate you against other kinds of facts, right? Those people are that's just fake news. They're just drinking the Kool-Aid. And, the best example of that is it creates this trust gap, right? So Fox News is the most, and in several different polls, it comes out as the most trusted name in news. And in fact, it's also the least trusted name in news. And you can imagine who trusts and doesn't trust it. And then we have good data like this as well. These are just data that we collected not right before the election on how much you trust all these different factors. And you see, again, you get this huge, conservatives trust Trump way more than liberals do, but they also trust the US Congress, probably because they see it in their favor. Then the Supreme Court, police, they trust their family and friends more. Again, liberals trust scientists, the CDC, online news, TV news more. So we have different people that we trust, right? So it's hard to break through that environment. These are just two that don't show any difference. Social media is equal and trusting your own position, right? So it's not just that one side is less trusting the other, they trust different sources, right? So all of this kind of stews in this, again, it's a natural stew, but a toxic one, right? Where you get these three forces, the moralization, that it's about good and evil, and this fuels this factualization process. so that you generate these different facts. These different facts are then stamped into you through socialization, this environment. And that, again, makes them, the more you believe these facts, the more they reinforce your moral position, the more they then bias you, and you get this mix of, again, what I would say are normal processes, right? These are all things that happen. Groups tend to moralize things, factualize things, and socialize groups or socialize members, right? But then they're in this intense state, right, where we've had this long term, and there's a lot of reasons, a lot of things that are going on. But the point I want to make now is that it can also be intensified by things like technology is probably intensifying these sorts of things. Some of the incentive structures are intensifying them, but they can also be intensified by political actors, right? So again, what I would say is the American experiment was an uphill evolutionary battle. We're not designed as creatures to hang out with people who don't look like us and don't believe the things what we believe, and somehow make nice with each other, make laws and policies, right? We're groupy creatures. Group conflict is the rule rather than the exception. And it's easy, if you want to intensify that, it's easy for a political actor to do that. It's easy for a political act. It's much easier for a political actor to divide people than it is to bring people together. And there's clearly the case, even though these processes all predate Trump, that Trump has been sort of a toxic force in this, right? He is reinforcing all these things. He's moralizing that they're bad, right? We're good. He literally says polls that support my side are right, other ones are wrong. So that, the bias, he clearly is saying the media, don't pay attention to their media is wrong. They'll only pay attention to ours. So again, it's clear, political actors and other factors can exacerbate this process, even though they're relatively natural processes. And what you get sort of at the end, I'm rushing through, so I'm late here. So, what you get here is this kind of partisan looking glass phenomenon. We have two sides sort of looking at each other through the lens of genuine moral differences, partisan bias, selective media exposure, so that, in the past, again, or, sometimes you can imagine people seeing the other side as dumb, and those stereotypes are there. Both sides see the other side as dumb and their side as smart. But what happens through this lens, right, is this metastasizing, this view of the two sides as evil. But through the lens of these factors, right, the other side seems evil. And that sort of that view, when you look at that of the two sides as being so different and so evil, right, is what stimulates the generation of alternative facts and this idea of fake news, misperceptions and partisan animosity. And they're bad, we're good. If you believe the other side is bad and you're good, government's not going to work, right? And you can't compromise. You've got different facts. None of that's going to work. Tends to make people angry. People lose trust in government, turn to populist government. So all these sort of cascading effects that occur through this psychological lens. So let me just end really quickly with a couple of statements about fixing all this. So again, what I see, we're in this kind of outrage spiral where you get these reinforcing processes where you've got partisan animosity. The more the two sides hate each other, the more it makes them biased in the way they process information, how they feel about each other. The more biased you are, the more negative views you get, right? The more negative views you get, the more biased. So the two they're fueling each other, right? So how do we break out of this outrage spiral, right? How do we get out of this? And this is the question that everybody's obviously interested in. And I want to just say some general things. There's kind of two general approaches to this, right? There's a cold approach and a hot approach. So the cold approach is, again, some way to try to improve reasoning about political information, could somehow make things better. And this is usually what we talk about, things like algorithms, changing those, or warnings, or improving people's intellectual humility or something like that, educating them somehow, right? And there's lots of attempts at that. And my argument is that they don't work very well. Let me just give you, again, really quick examples. This is a study one of my students did, Becky Grady, and where she presented people with fake news, gave them a warning, trying to stop them. Either the warning either came after the fake news, right with the fake news, or before the fake news, telling them it was going to be fake. And then she either measured how much they believed it as true right away, or she waited 2 weeks and came back to them. Well, what you see is that the warnings work pretty well immediately. So both the warning them during the news or warning them before news brought these numbers way down. The number of people are way down that believe it, and it squashed the partisan bias, right? These are also information, some of the information was congruent with their political views, some was incongruent, right? The warning after didn't work, but look at what happens 2 weeks later. So this seems to suppress it. Oh yeah, people are not believing the information and being more fair politically. If you wait 2 weeks, it all pops back up again. All these numbers, they're believing the information again, and the partisan bias exists. So the partisanship persisted even through these warnings, right? So it's hard to stamp these out. Another just quick point is you might think science is the solution, right? We'll give people science. Well, when we look at the meta-analysis, right, some of those studies in the meta-analysis were non-scientific information. They were just examples of behavior that was either liberal or conservative friendly. And some was science studies, like those ones I told you about, like the Lord, Leper, and Ross study. So if you look at how biased they are, you might think, oh, well, the solution to bias is science. You give them the science and that'll correct things. Well, when you give them the science, it just gets sucked into the hopper of political bias. In fact, people were somewhat more biased in processing scientific information than they were non-scientific information, right? So the argument I want to make is these cold approaches, you can try them, right? But the obstacle they're facing is how much heat there is, right? That somehow when I talk about these, when you try to improve reasoning and political information, I say it's kind of like trying to start a mediation during a bar fight, right? There's a big fight going on, and unless you can dial down that temperature somehow, right, it's going to be really hard to make any of these interventions work if there's that much hatred between the two sides, right? So somehow we have to bring that down. And again, that process is what many people point to. I'll just end with this quote from James Mattis that captures this well. What concerns me most as a military man is not our external adversaries, it's our internal divisiveness. We are dividing into hostile tribes, cheering against each other, fueled by emotion and mutual disdain that jeopardizes our future. Instead of rediscovering our common ground and finding solutions, right? So that's somehow, how do we bring the country together is the big challenge. And thanks for listening. These are a whole bunch of my collaborators, students, and others, and I'm happy to take questions. Sorry, I ran a little long.
Professor Ditto, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And as you might expect, there's been a lot of questions that have emerged in the question and answer forum, so I will be sure to get to those in just a second. Thank you to you and your students in the Hot Cognition Lab, and also thank you for giving us the sage words of advice from Mad Dog Mattis. Unexpected for the day. So one of the first questions came from a colleague of mine, Professor Simone Chambers, who studies deliberative democracy in the public sphere and has been thinking a lot about these themes. And she shares a question that I have that's uncomfortable for us in the academy to answer, that deals with the question of asymmetrical polarization. That some of the findings in political science suggest that both elite and mass polarization are not symmetrical phenomena. That in fact, conservatives have drifted further rightward than liberals have drifted leftward, or that Republicans have driven rightward more than Democrats have drifted leftward. And then in response to that, there seems to be a bit of an argument. Some who argue that this isn't a true finding. Some that argue that Democrats are going to catch up, that they will in kind start producing alternative belief systems, as you describe, causing them to drift as their ideology and group identities become more perfectly sorted. They will drift more further to the left. And then some recently provocative evidence, both from the mass and institutional perspective, that suggests that there are reasons why Democrats may not be prone to such extremities. So how do you situate this argument about asymmetrical polarization within your work? And let me return to Simone's question to make sure I do it justice. The polarization narrative often ignores this question of asymmetry and talks about polarization in terms of asymmetry between right and left. Isn't this misleading? So what are your thoughts on this process of asymmetrical polarization, alternative belief systems? How do you think about this as a psychologist?
Well, it's a great question and something I've spent a fair amount of time talking about. First, or thinking about. It's right. The first thing is there's lots of different levels at which, so that there's it depends on what kind of polarization you're talking about. Are you talking about an extrematizing of beliefs, an extrematizing of negative affect to one side, has more negative affect than the other toward the other, et cetera, et cetera. I treat it like first of all, like a psychologist, which is that I'm interested in sort of basic, I'm not a political scientist. I get interested in the sort of the basic psychological processing. And that's when you look at these experiments that we did. Again, a big issue is whether conservatives are more biased than liberals, right? Is that sort of rigidity of the right or the sort of rigidity of the extremes has been the debate that's been going on since the 1950s and Adorno's authoritarian personality and whatnot, right? So that question came up. That study, that meta-analysis was designed to sort of look at it. And I think what that shows is that both sides are capable of bias, right? Both sides have that substrate, right? And I think, again, that's part of group living, is we tend to sort of favor our own group. So we see that, what else is going on that might extrematize it on one side rather than another, right? There's all kinds of things, different sorts of, I don't think that those data, I think who's more biased probably varies over time, right? And there's lots of factors involved, things like what is threatening in that particular time. Is it true that the conservative worldview is sort of under more threat than the liberal worldview generally? And so that might make people more biased. It's certainly the case that a culture or a political actor can exacerbate that. And we see that on the left, there's more of a norm of honesty, accountability. On the right, there's less of that, right? And so and partly because Trump encouraged that sort of thing, and so that could again develop a culture of sort of just believing the things you want to believe, rejecting other kinds of facts. I guess the ultimate, why I sometimes resist making strong arguments about those things as a psychologist, right, is I don't think liberal and conservative are people treat them like they're introverts and extroverts, like it's something real, right? But those are just claims that people make. They're self-descriptive statements that people will make at various times. Those things differ. Who calls themselves, the same policy can be a conservative policy or a liberal policy, depending on how it's spun. All those things that are the whole thing's very fluid, right? You've got these two sides that are fighting. What I'm interested in mostly is how similar they are in some ways. In this kind of weird mirror image view, they seem to behave similarly. There's clearly, I don't think, however, you should take my findings that you find in the laboratory that they both show equal bias to suggest that necessarily in the real world now that conservative views and liberal views are equally correspondent with reality. It just doesn't seem to be the case.
Thank you so much for that. Lots of follow-up questions, and I will pass them on to you in our discussion, but I wanted to make sure we got a diversity of opinions here. One of our participants was very interested in moral taste buds evolve. So, sort of thinking back at the root processes of your talk, they ask, how do people develop these preferences over the 5 moral taste buds? Presumably people are not born liberal or conservative. Mm-hmm. So at what point in our lives do we start weighing our moral compass? And I will add my very small corollary to this talk, which is, what do you make of the distribution of moral tastes on the left and the relative clustering on the right, just as a data artifact? Like, how do you reconcile the extraordinary clustering of the 5 moral foundations for the conservatives in your sample? And my second corollary is, what would happen if we ran that not with liberals and conservatives, but Trump and non-Trump supporters, or ardent levels of Trump supporters?
Yeah, well, I'll try and be brief, right? Because to get as many questions in as possible. Yeah, the moral taste buds idea, right? So the idea, this is a way of trying, so morality pro-social behavior is always kind of a puzzle for human understanding. Like, how does that happen? What would encourage people, right? And the idea is that group living is powerful. People have developed intuitions that suppress selfishness and sort of promote cooperation with other people, make them more selfless. And if you didn't have those, you would do worse. The kind of best example is something like harm, right? Is that people imagine, if you've had a baby, you know, the babies are terrible roommates. They cry, they scream, they poop, they pee, they do all kinds of terrible things. But, and if you said, I hate that little baby because he's doing all these annoying things, right? Then and you hurt that baby, that's not gonna help your chances in the genetic lottery here, right? So people who have that, I see this cute thing, it's vulnerable, it needs to be taken care of, that sort of intuition of I need to take care of vulnerable people, right, is something that if people had that, they would be better caretakers, and it would play out, evolutionarily. And that's sort of the same idea behind all those, right? That people have these intuitions. They get built up, and so everybody has those, right? Different cultures, subcultures can emphasize one versus the other. Probably personality characteristics, things like empathy. Some people are born with a strong sense of empathy, other people with less developed. That's going to lead you one way or another, right? This disgust sensitivity, purity. Some people are kind of bothered by contamination more than others. And so there's individual differences, there's cultural differences, there's a whole mix of things that would be interesting to, obviously there's lots of research to figure out how you develop these different sensitivities, but you get them, right? The data cluster idea, I don't know what quite, what to say. Again, that pattern shows up again and again and again and again. And the idea really is that the clustering at on the conservative side is the more evolutionarily typical pattern, right? Most cultures care a lot about harm, fairness. They care about group loyalty, purity, those things like that. And what sort of the classic liberal education does is sort of drive some of that out of you. Says, well, you don't have to obey authority all the time, and tradition isn't everything, and those are just conventions. And sexual behaviors that other people think are icky because they're they seem to defile your spiritual soul, right? Well, that isn't something we accept. Yeah, sure, those they're sexual mores, but those things aren't important. So there's a sense in which the liberals, the real unusual pattern, right, where only harm and fairness are perceived as real moral virtues.
Thank you. And did you have a guess at what Trump supporters would look like if instead of using liberal?
We probably have data. We probably have data on that somewhere. I mean, I think they tend to show the more extreme view, right? So more authority, purity, and loyalty. My sense would that they would likely be sort of an extreme version. Although, yeah, it's interesting. I guess it's possible they could be a little bit more mixed up, because it's not a particularly ideological movement, right? It's sort of a personality-based movement. So interesting question. We can find out.
Now, one of the questions always comes up in a talk like this for those of us who are feeling, to various degrees over the last year, increasingly panicked about our political moment, is what can be done about it. I know in you and co-authors article in Science, you speculate about a number of reforms, elites taking a more conscientious approach to describing political division, humility among members of the body politic in being asked to describe why we hold our political views as an act of re-rationalization, focusing on policy outcomes rather than emotions. So perhaps you could walk through some of these recommendations and then highlight some of the things that you think we can do and what the political system can be doing to remedy this moment.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult question, right? We're in this moment because it's hard to come back, right? I mean, that's not, and again, I think that the backdrop of this is that, liberal democracy is not our natural state, right? Our natural state is kind of hang out with people who look and feel like we do, and try to hurt the people who don't look like us and don't feel like us, right? So this idea of bringing people together is really tough, right? And it's easier to do the other process. Kind of fomenting group conflict is a downhill evolutionary putt, right? I mean, it just, it's easy to do. It picks up on people's natural tendency to be groupy, right? So what do you do in this situation? So the problem is that a lot of the psychological explanations are really difficult to scale up, right? So intellectual humility, actually, people who are intellectually humble are more open to new information. You can make people more intellectually humble in certain ways, but I don't know how to make everybody more intellectually humble. I don't know how to apply that at a big level and make the country intellectually humble, right? Similarly, people do better if they like somebody more. If I like you, right, I'm more tolerant of your views. And I always point to this as being one of the historical problems, right? So the quick story is when Newt Gingrich came in 1992, or I guess it was right now, came in to Speaker of the House. Essentially, he wanted people to kind of get out of Washington, and there was lots of money, that had to be raised, and so he shortened the congressional work week to 3 days. Increasingly over time, people stopped living in Washington, D.C. They would live elsewhere. So when they used to kind of hang out together, right, it's harder to be mean to somebody if you've had a beer with them the night before, your kids are playing soccer together, to demonize them, that if you just have never seen each other, right? But how do you do it? So how do you make people like each other first? That's hard. So all of those things are problematic. I think one thing is the incentive structure, which is not a particularly psychological answer, right? But I think the incentive structure is so perverse, right? So conflict is a good business model. It's a good business. Nobody wants to watch people get along, right? If you're on TV, you want to create that. If you want to get money in Congress, you want to be aggressive and attack the other side. And so all the incentives are for conflict. And some studies have been done where if you incentivize people for accuracy, they actually do better. They show less partisan bias, but that's not the natural incentive structure in this country, right? Everything is conflict is rewarded, and so if we could somehow dial that down, get money out of more, less money in politics might help. Another thing that again is not completely psychological, but third parties, right? So part of this is it's one against another. Right, if you have multiple parties, then that gets diffused a little bit, right? So it's not just, well, I disagree with you, and all I have to do is disagree with you. Well, I have to figure out how the three of us or four of us or parties go together, and that may, and there's some evidence just from experimental studies that kind of multiple groups lowers conflict. So those are, I mean, none of those. It feels to me like they're fantasy sort of ideas. Or things that can work at again, maybe I shouldn't disparage. There are things that work potentially at an individual level, right? That you can have better relationships with your friends and your family, and things like that. Another really interesting finding I'll just mention just really quickly that just came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is that people try to solve conflict by giving facts. Facts don't work very well. What works much better is personal experience. So if you can share a personal experience with people, with somebody of the other party about how you've been hurt by immigration, let's say, that tends to get people's sympathy, tends to pull people together with people sharing common experiences, right? And so that there are hints in the psychological literature, but how to scale those up and how to apply them is very challenging.
Fantastic. We have time for one more question. And I'm torn because the political scientist in me wants to ask you a challenging question, pushing you outside of your body of work, which is, how does a psychologist think about the role of political institutions, constitutions, norms, rules, and how do you think about the perceived erosion of these in exacerbating where we are? So chew on that if you feel like answering it. I didn't warn you, so I won't make you. The other question, and this is more as someone who's shocked by our moment, is a question that's come up from our audience. How do we think about the production of alternative beliefs? How do we think about the creation of these alternative belief systems? Many of the examples you gave us, right, describe a process where factual political beliefs are then, through a process of moralization, refracted into a different type of factual belief. But many of the beliefs that we're reading about now, conspiratorial, the paranoid turn in American politics, seem to have no basis in fact, in limited basis in morality. What do you think of this conspiratorial turn in our politics? It's an old one, but a newly front and center one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Both of those are good questions. So yeah, the way I often state it is that partisan bias is a team sport, right? So people, there's lots of people who have generally these feelings like they don't like liberals or they don't like conservatives, and as information gets shared out there, right, people just pick up the ones that they like. Oh, I like that one, right? That one, and that they're more likely to accept it because it makes them feel good. Then other people like that, right? So it's kind of like a menu of things that's out there, and that people sort of absorbing and taking in the ones that that work for them, and they might not have thought of those themselves, right? So they go, I don't know why masks don't work, until somebody they read on the internet, somebody says, oh yeah, well, they hold your own breath in and you're breathing your own CO2, or, oh, okay, now that sounds right to me. And if you're not very skeptical, you accept that, right? If you don't want to believe that, then you can find all the problems with it. So it's this kind of picking up of these, again, the shared kind of group aspect of it. And conspiracy theories are super groupy, right? They're part of it is connecting with other people. And discovering QAnon's a very interesting phenomenon because it's almost like a video game, right? They give you these clues and you have to find them, and right, but they're generated by other people, right? You don't have to do all the work of thinking up alternative facts yourself. There's lots of other people helping you, right? And I guess the other answer is, yeah, we're a country of norms, apparently not a country of laws, right? Is that many of these institutions require you to have faith in them, right? And people do until they get agreed, right? So it's like, I'm fine with Congress. I believe in democracy until I think they steal the election. Then I'm gonna now I'm gonna take over, right? And that's why the grievance and the moralization justifies anti-democratic behavior, right? If you're wronged enough, it will lead you to believe that violence is the only answer, right? And so these institutions are really vulnerable from when sort of this animosity breaks down whatever faith that we have in these institutions, which is really this ephemeral thing that's holding them together. It's very hard to punish a president, we realize, right? You can't just make it happen. If there's these long processes that go on, you have to have faith that they'll work, right? And I think we're in a fragile state. I mean, the problem I see is that this is going to keep going. Every time one side, beating Donald Trump in an election just makes conservatives and Trump supporters more angry. And then when conservatives win one, that makes liberals angry, and everybody just escalates through this sort of grievance and conflict process. So it's tough. Like, as I said, in the back seat, when those kids are fighting, that doesn't end spontaneously, right? Somebody's got to go back there. And so we have to figure out how, in US politics, to go back there and fix it up.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ditto. That was a fantastic talk, and
thank you.
One that we benefited from. I'm afraid trying to figure out how to share my screen to call attention to some of the work, but apparently my privacy blocker on this new computer won't let me. So I'm going to have to do this verbally. First, Professor Ditto, thank you so much. In the remarks in the audience, many of you asked how you can learn more about the underpinnings of polarization, its causes. I would refer you first to the Science article co-authored by Professor Ditto and leading figures across sociology, political science, and psychology that give you just diverse perspectives on this question, both on the causes of polarization, the institutional determinants of polarization, historical. You can find work from, many of you asked about algorithms, social media and exposure. Christopher Bale at Duke University providing some distressing insight that exposing people to alternative perspectives actually exacerbates polarization. You can read Liliana Mason's work, Uncivil Agreement, which will give you an extraordinary rundown of the literature and also explain how increasingly pure sorting of party attachment and group identity that Professor Ditto is describing is a hallmark of our new polarized moment. So we're having, in the field writ large, a renaissance of research on polarization with, unfortunately, some terribly depressing conclusions about our path forward. And so I guess I could say to the students and academics in the room, there's room for continued work and smart tests of how we can bring down the temperature and work our ways through this. I'd also refer you in the audience to Professor Ditto's lab on hot cognition, as came up in the talk today. Just an extraordinary example of the work being done on this campus on questions like this from such a diverse perspective. And Professor Ditto, how amazing it is to see so many of your students showing up in the talk as contributing to this work. So thank you for that. And finally, again, I can't bring this up, but to the audience, on March 5th, we have our final talk. It's on grassroots social movements in America. Hari Han and her co-authors presenting work, Prisons of Reform. And so please look out and please, please look for our invitation and attend that. And with that, I want to thank Irvine. I want to thank Andy Hall. And again, Professor Ditto, thank you so much for your generously contributing your time and helping us all work our way through this today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Graham.
Signing off, everybody. Thank you so much.